Hi folks, so this is the third in my series of gear videos on my current 2023 gear list. And again, what I want to do is to go through my reasoning behind my choices. I want to show you what I'm planning on using at this stage and go through how I sort of arrived at that. Now I thought I'd do that in this particular case by talking about different ways of preparing food on the trail, and so different stoves and things like that. Some of my experience, some of my thoughts, which may or may not be correct. Again, it's my own sort of reason and logic that's being used to make these decisions, you know, and you might come to different conclusions. But one of the things that stands out for me is if you lock yourself into just one method of preparing food, you can potentially run into problems along the way. That, at least that seems reasonable to me. I mean, for a fairly short walk, it's probably not an issue, and in fact, I've used different systems exclusively on relatively short walks. But once you start going a bit further, it's quite possible that you might encounter problems along the way. For example, there might be fire bans, which might limit the type of cooking method you can use if you're cooking your food. And in other areas, maybe only certain types of fuel are available. So that could be a deciding factor or a limiting factor potentially if you're using a different type of fuel. So what I'm wondering is whether it's possible to put together a system that is flexible enough and still light enough to allow you to take advantage of different meal preparation methods, so different cooking methods and so forth. And that's kind of what I'm working on. So I'll show you what I've come up with so far, but I thought the process I'd go through to do that would be to start with some of the pros and cons of common methods and just take things from different approaches and try and combine them together and just show you what I come up with. So hopefully that'll be of interest to you. And if it's not, then maybe just jump to the end and have a look at what I came up with, and that might give you some ideas if you don't want to wade through the rest of the video. Okay, so let's start with a fairly common method, as I understand it, with thru-hikers, and that's cold soaking. And this is something that I'm not really very familiar with. I experimented with it a little bit. It is something I'd like to be able to do because obviously one of the advantages is that you don't need to carry any fuel. So the overall weight of your system, or a stove for that matter, so the overall weight of your system gets quite light. So basically that's using some sort of jar, usually a plastic jar like this. This is an ice cream container I got a while back, and putting dry food in there and rehydrating it. So I'll put a couple of videos on cold soaking, a couple of links in the description. Another method some people use, they use a bag to rehydrate the food instead of a container. So again, that's even less bulky, and I think there are commercially available ones as well. So that's something that I've looked at in the past and thought, wow, that'd be pretty cool, getting rid of the food. But my experiments so far have been, less than ideal. So again, it's something widely used by ultralight hikers. It's the lightest method. It might be an easier method in some cases because you might be able to, in certain towns, buy ingredients for cold soaking, whereas you might not be able to buy, say, pre-made meals like your backcountry cuisine, your various types of pre-made meals, which is something that I tend to use quite a lot. So it might give you some flexibility there. So it's something that I like. One of the things that concerns me about cold soaking, though, is hygiene. And I guess, I could be just being paranoid about this, but I have asked a few questions of people, about hygiene, and I haven't really got a particularly satisfactory response so far. One of the things that concerns me is I really dislike using plastics for anything really. For drinking bottles, I guess, because they're the lightest, but beyond that, in terms of the storage and preparation of food, I have my doubts about them. One is the microplastics and that you pick up that's now in pretty much everything, and I know you get that from drinking water as well. But the bigger issue for me is more the plastic being a medium for carrying bacteria and things like that. So I've used so many plastic containers in the past where you just haven't been able to get rid of residue. Even cleaning them as thoroughly as I felt I could. There's cracks or not cracks, but little gouges and chips and things like that in the surface that seem to just capture everything. So even generally day to day, I tend not to use plastic. So for example, I use these little glass containers for storing leftovers and things like that in the fridge at home. And when I'm traveling, I have like in the car a stainless steel container for storing my leftovers and that, rather than using plastic, because I feel that I can clean them much more easily. So I guess those are my main sort of criticisms with the plastic containers, at least, that are used for cold soaking. Other things that I consider, that could be problematic with cold soaking is that if you have a plastic container, you can't really, you've then lost, assuming you're not carrying any other metal containers that could be used for boiling water, you've lost one method of purifying water. And to me, having a bit of a, I guess, paranoia about, having some survival tools with me, it seems like you're giving up something that is, important to carry. I know a lot of survival kits and things like that suggest always carrying some sort of container that you can use not only for carrying water but also for boiling water and other sort of cooking tasks. So if you are in a situation where you do need to purify water and you haven't got access to the normal water purification tablets or filters or whatever that you've got access to, I know that I carry all that stuff, but if you're separated from it, or you use up that resource, or it fails in some way, then I think having that extra method of purifying water is important. Those are probably the main things. There are a few lesser issues that sort of concern me a little bit. For example, perhaps less variety and flexibility in your meals. So there's an awful lot of different dehydrated meals you can buy, and there's obviously a lot of flexibility there. Some of those I'm sure can be used for cold soaking as well, but there is, not having much experience with it, I do worry about that. And one thing that sort of makes that a little bit more of a concern, particularly in Australia, is that going around to different supermarkets, I've been intentionally looking for stuff that could be used for cold soaking, and I'm really not finding a lot. Like a lot of the stuff that you see on the US-based YouTube channels and things like that, I'm just not seeing it in Australia. So I wonder to what extent those products are available here. So perhaps it's something that might be easier to do in the US or maybe some other countries than here. Or maybe I'm just not looking in the right place, or, I guess that's the other thing, you do have to have the experience and I suppose the experience being the main thing of finding those different ingredients and putting them together, knowing what works together and what doesn't. So perhaps also it's a little bit more fiddly and maybe requires a little bit more planning. So to summarise, I like the idea of cold soaking, but I have a few concerns about plastic containers and other issues like that. So what do I take from that? Well, one of the things that I picked up a while back was the Vargo bot. And this is something which intrigued me because it's actually got a seal and you can use it for cold soaking. Okay, so you basically got a sealable container made of titanium, and so therefore it can be used for cooking. Obviously, if you can see the colour of this, it's been used quite a lot. This is my main cooking pot now, and it can be used for cooking, so you can boil water in it, purify water, all that sort of stuff. You can carry water in it if you want to, because you can put the water in and then seal the top like that. And you can also use it for cold soaking. So what I take from that is if I use something like the Vargo bot, I've got the capacity to cold soak at a slightly greater weight. Obviously, it's not as light as some of these other options, but I can do it. If I want to cold soak, I can actually do it. And the other thing I love about this is that it has having that sealable lid means that I can store all my cooking stuff in there, and it's not going to fall out in the pack. You know, I don't have to worry about having a special bag to go over the outside or, you know, anything like that. I can just, it's just all self-contained. I can just chuck it in and away we go. So that's what I'm taking from cold soaking, the Vargo bot. I know there are some other options, like for example, there are rubber seals that can go over the top of some of the pots. Okay, that's something I've seen. I'm not 100% sure I would trust those. I don't know how well they seal and so forth. I much prefer something more positive, like a titanium pot. So it's a little bit heavier and probably, well, definitely heavier than a normal titanium pot. But I think the payoff of being able to do cold soaking is worth it. And then other types of cooking as well. So now I'll just move on very briefly to Esbit, briefly because I think there's probably been you know, a move away from this sort of cooking method. You know, most ultralighters and camp and hikers in general tend to use some of these other methods over here, but I'll touch on it briefly. So years ago I had one of these fold out years, as in, you know, probably when I was a teenager, I had one of these fold out little army stoves that had the solid fuel Esbit blocks that you put in them, and I used that for a while, and you know, I thought it was reasonable. There are much lighter versions now, so you don't have to have something that's sufficient. You don't have to have something that big. You can have very simple little burners like this one here, okay, that fold up and take up next to no space in your pack. And the only downside with these is that you do need to use a windshield with them, but you can get very lightweight, or you can make very lightweight windshields that make the whole setup much lighter than those older systems. I've also seen things, well, actually I own one of these little, what they call a graham cracker. Trouble is I forgot how it actually works. So I've got all these little bits and I don't really know how they work, but yeah, that's an even lighter option. So you can go really light with that sort of system. Some of the pros, you can't spill the fuel obviously because it's a solid block. They're good for short trips, and that way you can just take exactly the amount of fuel that you need. You know, if you need 3 or 4 blocks, then that's what you take. They work in high elevation and cold and things like that, so that's really good. Some of the cons, the fuels are expensive, these little blocks. They're smelly and toxic. You know, the manufacturer recommends using gloves with them. I'm, you know, not really comfortable about having these lying around in things that I'm going to be cooking in. So what I usually do is I carry my cook kit inside my pot. So having these inside the pot, and these little seals always seem to break, I find, you know, just from moving around inside the pot and having things bump up against them. So yeah, I'm not really keen on that. There are less toxic alternatives, of course, some, you know, like alcohol based and so forth, so that's something, if that's a system you're interested in, it's worth looking at. They leave a nasty residue on the pots, you know, and also on the cook gear itself that you've got to get rid of, so that's another thing, you know, that sort of, I don't know, gets all over everything, you know, if you're trying to clean it and that, you know, having the tools, it's okay if you're in a campsite or something which has, you know, plenty of running water and that, but if you're in a more remote location, then you have to carry some extra water to clean the pots and do all that sort of stuff. So yeah, just generally they seem a lot messier, and I don't think in terms of efficiency they're quite up with the gas stoves and the alcohol stoves. They're also slow to boil, and sometimes, you know, depending on the conditions, you might go through an entire tablet and not boil the water, and so then you're going to have to use another tablet, which, you know, you probably won't use the whole tablet, so you'll have like little bits left over. So yeah, just in general, I found them kind of messy, and, you know, not really something I wanted to mess with. There's also no control over the flame, so when you're cooking in that, you can't sort of you can't really control it much, but then that's true with some other systems as well. And I guess the final thing is that it's difficult, you know, when you've got lots of these little blocks, if you're doing a really big trip, to sort of pack them all in a, you know, a way that, you know, they're not going to get damaged, or, you know, and they also tend to take up a lot of space. So yeah, generally I'm not really into those sort of things, but I think they are a good emergency method of heating food if you need to. So I suppose if I was going to take anything from that, it might just be one of these blocks, and perhaps having something in place within my cook system that would allow me to use one of those if I needed to. Okay, so for example, when I was doing the South Coast track in Tasmania, I actually used not this brand but a different one because I had problems with a lighter, and that particular brand could be lit quite easily with a striker. Yeah, it sort of got me through, allowed me to cook when I otherwise couldn't cook. So it was worth having. So maybe something like that as a fire starter, or just as a backup cooking method if you run out of fuel or whatever, could be worth considering. So let's move on to wood stoves, and I'll try and go through these a bit quicker now. Wood stoves is something I haven't really used a lot, but I have done. But I have, made plenty of fires. I've got, stuff I can use for camping and that, like a pot-bellied stove that burns wood. The actual camping ones, I don't really have much here to show you. There's this one here, which is basically just a mini sort of fire pit. That's pretty much all it is. It basically just contains the wood when you're burning it. There's much more sophisticated and better ones than that. I've seen some that they're cylindrical and they contain all of the fuel within them. They also use a gasification system as well to sort of maximize the burn. So there's some pretty cool ones out there actually. What I've got that I've considered using or used carried on different trips is this little lightweight titanium system here, which I think is made by Trail Designs, and it's part of the same system as this sort of tie try, or this cone that I've used a lot. And basically it has a little stand here, or a little grid that you put all your fuel on, and then you sit that down on top of it. Okay, and then you put all your fuel in there. This base is just to protect the ground, and again that's something that this other system doesn't have. And then the actual tie try goes on top of it like that with your pot, and that's how you do your cooking. So I thought that was pretty cool, but I very quickly sort of got bored of carrying all those little tiny bits of titanium, particularly since I didn't use them most of the time. So most of the time with this, I just use an alcohol stove. So I'll come back to that because that's kind of important. But just in terms of the pros and cons, I think the number one pro with these is that you don't have to carry any fuel, and you don't really have to worry about running out of fuel per se, because you just pick up the fuel as you go. In terms of cons, now I'll admit I'm somebody who, when I go camping, whether it's car camping or whatever, I'm not a big fan of fires. So, I quite often get frustrated at campsites when just about everybody has a campfire going, because most of the time it's completely pointless. I live in Australia. I'm absolutely sweltering at the moment. At coldest temperatures, okay, we do get down to fairly cold temperatures in some parts of Australia at certain times, but 99% of the time when people are camping, you don't need a fire for warmth. And cooking, it just seems like a massive inconvenience to me. I carry a gas stove on my car. I can easily cook with that. It takes me no time at all. It's done and dusted, and I can get on with whatever else I want to do, take photos or whatever. It's nice to sit around a campfire, I get that, but it's generally an inefficient way of preparing food. I've been sitting there having eaten my meal several hours ago, watching people who started cooking at the same time I did with a campfire, and they're still going late into the night. Now, that's not necessarily the case with these type of hiking stoves. Okay, so you can just put what fuel you need in here, and you can get a small fire going fairly quickly and cook. So they are more efficient. I guess in terms of the bigger issues from my point of view, one is whether it's a big campfire somebody's put together, or just a small fire like this. You're taking all of that wood from the local environment, so you're depleting that resource. Whenever wood falls on the ground, it's not wasted. It biodegrades, it breaks down, and it drives a whole ecosystem. So there's animals feeding off that wood and breaking it down, and it enriches the soil. So you're taking that resource away, and that's one of the reasons that collecting of wood is banned in a lot of national parks, because it's not a good thing to do. You're basically burning the wood. Okay, maybe the ash might go back into the ground, but it doesn't have the same cumulative benefit. Okay, so really it's not a good thing to do, particularly in national parks, to be taking wood. And you might say, oh, it's only a small amount of wood, but then that's for you, and there might be 100 people doing that, or 1,000 people, or 10,000 people in a year doing the same thing. So they're removing that timber from the environment. So really, I don't like that part of it. You have to go through and collect fuel. There's an issue with water and snow. So if it's been raining a lot and you can't find dry wood, then that's going to be a problem. So there's a number of limitations. Oh, the final thing I'll mention actually, well, two things. One is that fires may be banned in national parks. So if you're relying on cooking your food using wood, then it's quite possible you might arrive, particularly on larger trips, at places where you can't use your wood burner. So you will need an alternative anyway. You'll need some other type of stove. And the other thing is that, and two other things. One is that the ash has to be dealt with. So I've talked about protecting the ground here from the heat, but also you'll end up with some ash left over, and what are you going to do with it? If you just chuck it on the ground, you could potentially start a fire. So maybe you'll need to quench that. So you'll potentially need to carry more water with you. The other thing is that the smoke can be annoying, or it can affect people. So I know my daughter, for example, gets asthma, which can be triggered by smoke. I don't, but I do get sinus problems and that when there's a lot of people burning, fires around the place. And that makes it hard to sleep and all those other things. So really, I just find fires messy and just unnecessary. However, I do think having the capacity to burn wood as a fuel is really useful. So what I've been doing, as I said, I hate carrying all these little tiny bits of titanium. So what I've actually taken from all this is just the grid and the little stand that it goes on. In fact, I might trim that down, make it a bit smaller. So those two things are the things that I've been carrying for quite a while. And my logic behind it is when I've got either a windscreen or I've mostly been carrying this tie try, I can easily build a fire inside that. I might put something across the ground like some foil. Okay, so you might include some foil maybe as well, some lightweight foil, just to protect the ground. And then you build your timber up on top of that, or your wood, just little tiny bits, and you can get a little fire going inside the tie try. So I think having the capacity to create fire is always important. Okay, you need some method of producing fire when you're travelling around in the wilderness, but having the capacity to convert your stove into a wood burning stove, I think is really important too. So that's what I take from the whole wood burning stove area. Okay, so lastly, I just want to talk about the gas stoves and the alcohol stoves. And I don't really think I need to spend too much time on these because there's plenty of information on them online, and they're something which are commonly used by hikers. So I probably won't be telling you anything you don't already know. I've used that particular gas stove quite a lot for travelling. I think it's a Snow Peak, fairly relatively light, but I've recently bought one of these ones here, which is a BRS stove, which is even lighter, so it's like 20 grams or 25 grams or something, pretty light. So a lot of people like those. I've sort of moved away from them a bit. I used them for a number of years, but then I kind of moved over more to alcohol stoves, mainly because of these containers. They just annoy the hell out of me because I don't know how much fuel is in them. You can guesstimate how long they're going to last, but that's not really that good. And I've seen plenty of people just carrying, far more fuel than they need to because, they need just slightly more than what's in one container, or they're not exactly sure how much is in a container, so they just chuck another one in to be on the safe side. So, and then you've got to do something with these as well, like what do you do with these containers when you're finished with them in terms of recycling and that. So I've got a lot of these lying around, and most of them are partially used. So and they're bulky as well. They take up space. You can get little ones that will fit inside pots, okay, and they're good for short trips and that. So I'm not completely dissing these stoves. I think they've got their place, and certainly in some areas this might be the only thing that you can use. Okay, so it might be a fuel stove only area or a gas stove only area. so in certain national parks, for example, in which case that's what you need. It could also be that you might not be able to get the alcohol that you need when you go to, if you're using alcohol, if you're wanting to use an alcohol stove, you might only be able to get these fuel canisters in certain towns or certain locations. So again, as an example, when I flew into the start of the South Coast track in Tasmania, I had to pre-order the fuel, and that was the fuel that was on offer, so that was all I could use. So I like them, but I generally prefer alcohol stoves. So alcohol stoves, you know, I don't really need to explain this. They just use alcohol or a similar fuel. There's one called heat, I think, in the US, which is used quite a lot, preferred over alcohol in some cases. I use methylated spirits mostly in these stoves. There's all sorts of different designs. So the earliest one I had was a Trangie. That was, again, when I was in my teens or early 20s or something like that, and it was a massive, heavy stove setup, but the actual burner itself is just that part there. These are great because you can also control the flame to some extent, okay? But they are heavy, and you know, there are much lighter options. There's some which are commercially made, like this one here, which I used for a while, but to be honest, I didn't really like it that much. It's actually a Vargo. I found it took a long time to bloom, and then, you know, could be blown out quite easily, and just took a very long time to cook things. This is a more recent one I've used, which is a Tokes, and this has been excellent. You know, it blooms really quickly and it cooks fantastic. I've got a few homemade ones here. That was one I bought, but it's a homemade design. This is one I made the other day, which I'll talk about later. And there's these little ones here as well from Chi Whiz. Okay, so I've been using alcohol stoves for quite a while. Primarily I've been using them with this Trail Designs cone. Okay, so the stove is in the bottom here, and you put your pot on the top, and it protects it from wind. So that's the important thing with an alcohol stove, is having some way of protecting the stove from wind to get the most efficient burn and you know, use as little fuel as possible. This breaks up into two pieces and folds into my pot. Okay, so that's a really, you know, compact setup and relatively lightweight. Okay, so that plus this little stove is the one I've been using mostly. Okay, the little Tokes. That pushes onto the bottom of my fuel bottle like that. So it actually just sits in the middle of my pot, and the tie try and all of that just sort of goes around it. And I also chuck in my my fire steel and anything else that I want to include with the cook pot. So that's really good, and that's what I've been using mostly. So what I'll do, I'll just quickly show you what that looks like, and then I'll talk about the changes I'm thinking of making. I will try and make another video where I compare some of the different stoves. I have done a little bit of comparative work so far. For example, I've compared that one there, the Vargo, with this one here, and I think I also compared it to that one. Okay, and I also did a small comparison between the gas stove and the alcohol stoves, just to see how they compared in terms of the amount of fuel use and therefore the amount of weight that was required for the fuel that you're carrying. And I'll put a link into a really good video that somebody else did actually, comparing the gas stoves and the alcohol stoves, and actually there's very little difference between them. So if you're choosing between one or the other, you know, based on weight and so forth, that's you know, not as big a difference as you might imagine. And I found the same thing when I did my testing. I found that the weight of fuel being used by both systems was comparable. So therefore, you know, to do X number of boils, there wasn't really that much of a disparity. So if you can cut the weight down as much as possible with an alcohol stove, like this one, okay, or even with your gas canister stove, you know, both systems are pretty much comparable. Okay, so I thought I'd bring you in a little bit closer and just show you my current setup and then I'll show you what I'm thinking of changing for 2023. This is going to be a big experiment because I don't know if it's going to work as well as what I'm going to show you now, but I'd like to do it for a couple of reasons. I'd like to reduce the weight a little bit, but that's not a big issue. What I'm hoping to do is also be able to use this space a little bit better. So I'd like to be able to actually fit other things in here. So maybe a small survival kit. You know, I mentioned before having a container like this that can carry water, but also be used for boiling water and cooking and things like that is good to have in a survival kit. So I thought, wonder if I can just combine the other items that I've got in my ultralight survival kit into here and just make that my survival kit. So that's what I'm thinking of doing. Whether it'll work or not, I don't know, but you know, I figured it was worth a little bit of experimentation. So again, cold soaking, capacity to cold soak by using a Vargo bot. Okay, so that's one method of food preparation covered. Now in here, I'll come back to that. I have my fuel and my stove. Now obviously that's not going to do for a long trip, but it will do for a lot of, you know, short multi-day trips, that amount of fuel. I haven't got it marked at this stage, but it's good to mark the fuel so that you know how much to use each time. But I like the way that stove just fits on the bottom there, and it's a really good stove. I found it really effective. That's a little Toke stove. Okay, so that's I shouldn't call it a stove, it's a burner actually. That's my burner and my fuel. I also have my fire steel, and I actually use the fire steel for starting the fires. I just don't see the point in using a lighter. It's much easier using a fire steel. I don't have to get my hands as close to the flame, and I'm not using up the fuel. So I do carry a lighter, but it's as an emergency item rather than as a primary method. Then I've got my titanium windshield or cone, and at the bottom I've got a little stainless steel grid. Okay, so let's briefly explain. Most of the time when I'm using this, I will just set it up. Okay, pretty easy to set up, very lightweight. Okay, like that. I put my burner down, fill it with fuel, light it, stick that on top, have my pot with the water in, drop that in, cover it, and then away we go. So that's all I have to do to use this as an alcohol stove. And I find this works in all sorts of conditions. I've had it, in windy conditions, rain, all sorts of different things. This will just be sitting outside in the rain, and you can see here that it's fully protected, so the rain just sort of drops, just goes off the side and doesn't really affect the boiling at all. So that's kind of my set point, my ideal current setup. Now I should add, there is a little bit of extra space in here, not a lot, so this cone sort of takes up a bit more space than it would if it wasn't conically shaped. But there is still enough space if I wanted to include a solid fuel, and that solid fuel could be used by just sitting it on top of there, okay, on top of the burner, and that'll work fine. It's got this little indentation, so the fuel's not going to dribble out or anything like that. Okay, at least one that size anyway. So that's an option if I wanted to carry that as a backup fuel. If I wanted to have a wood-based, if I wanted to have a wood fire, okay, so say I run out of alcohol but I still want to cook, well, I've got this little grid and I've got this little stand. I can stick them in the bottom, put that over the top, pile up some wood on top of that, get the fire going, and away we go. And finally, I've also got space in there, if I wanted to include this little BRS burner. Okay, so if I wanted to, I could have my BRS stove with me as well. So say, for example, I'm traveling and I end up somewhere where maybe a supermarket or a resupply, and they've got these little fuel canisters, but they haven't got alcohol. Okay, or maybe I might not be able to use the alcohol for a particular stretch of a trail because there's a fire ban. Okay, so some of these little alcohol burners cannot be used in areas where there's a fire ban. So again, I could just swap fuels and start using this one. So to me, that gives me a great deal of flexibility for not a lot of weight. Okay, so you're only adding like another 20 grams or so for that compared to the rest of your system, and you've got a multi-use, multi-fuel setup. Now, can I improve on this? Can I make it lighter? So I said I wanted to carry more stuff in here, maybe some survival items and things like that. So to do that, I'm going to have to free up some space because as perhaps you noticed when I opened this, this being cone-shaped actually takes up more space than it would if it just sat against the outer wall of the container. Okay, so I lose a lot of space in here, and if I don't want to carry separate items separately, I want to keep things together, which just means less likely to lose things and takes up a little bit less space in my pack. Then it would be nice if I could actually reduce the size of this. So what I've done as an experiment, I ordered in one of these Chi Whiz windshields, and this could be a potential alternative. I don't think it's going to give as much protection as that, so maybe it might not cope as well in wind or rain, but it's certainly a lot lighter and smaller. So by putting this in here, it goes around the edge and doesn't take up, well, hardly takes up any space at all. And I can still carry most of the other items. However, there are a couple of issues. One is that unlike the Tri, the Trail Designs, it doesn't have a way of supporting the pot, and this burner won't work without some sort of pot support. So I could, again, I got this from Chi Whiz, put a pot stand in there, and again, that's not going to add much weight over what I've already removed. Okay, so it's still going to be lighter, but that will allow me to raise the pot up. But, I hate having a lot of little bits and pieces. I mean, I should also say I also bought one of these little stoves from Chi Whiz to try as well, which is slightly smaller than that one, just out of interest's sake. But it doesn't really matter which of those I use. I'll do a bit of a comparison of them later. They still require a pot stand. So what I thought I'd do was see if I could come up with a design that didn't require a pot stand. And when I say come up with a design, I obviously mean look online and find some examples of pots that don't, some examples of burners that support the pot, okay, that have a built-in stand. And I looked at a number of different ones. One concern with some of these is that if your water is cold and your pot's cold, putting the pot on top can actually cool it down, and therefore, the flame drops down or goes out. So there are a few issues with using them. There are ways around that. You can heat your pot beforehand while it's still burning and then sit it on once it warmed up a little bit. Or there are designs which seem to work better and, not be affected so much by the cold, and also that bloom a little bit quicker. So this one I found here uses little ridges down the side. This is two bits of a can. The bottom bit is just the base that holds the fuel, and then the top bit has a series of pleats all the way around. Okay, and that actually creates channels for the gasified alcohol to escape through, which creates a ring of burners. Okay, and then you can just set your pot on top, and it doesn't seem like these are as affected by the cold, but I'll experiment. So that kind of makes the system slightly simpler. Okay, so you have your windshield, you have that inside, and then you can just put the pot directly on top. Now, I can still use this for cold soaking, okay, no problem. If I want to use solid fuel, I can just turn this over and put the solid fuel on. Except now we've got a problem. We're back to the same issue. How do I support the pot? So what I came up with, I haven't done it yet, but I'm thinking of just drilling or punching a few holes in the top of this windshield. And then I can actually run, I always carry a couple of titanium shepherd hooks. I can actually run those through there, and that will allow me to sit the pot on top. Okay, so I can potentially use solid fuel. So I can cold soak. With that modification, I should be able to use solid fuel. Of course, I can use alcohol. I'm still carrying these, so I can put those in the bottom, and I can create a small wood stove. It's probably not going to be as good, but you know, hopefully it'll do the trick. You know, if I'm just at a pinch, you know, I run out of fuel, I need to heat some water. Okay, so at a pinch I might be able to just build up a small fire in here, get it going. I might carry a little bit of foil to go underneath to protect the ground. So I've got that option. And finally, if I want to, I can chuck in the BRS stove, and I've got the capacity to use gas as well. And I haven't checked, but I suspect the combined weight of all of the items that I've got here is probably less than what I currently carry. However, whether it's going to function as well, I'm not sure. So I think that's going to have to be the subject of another video. Just looking at how this simplified and lighter setup compares to what I'm currently using with the Tri and with the Tokes burner. So that's what I'm going to do. I'll come back to you about that. I haven't quite worked out whether this is going to fit on the fuel bottle. Okay, so that's an important feature. I may have to come up with different stoves that perhaps have a slightly larger diameter so that that can fit inside, because I would like to save that extra bit of space. But those are the sort of things I'm working out, and I'll have to get back to you about whether it ends up working the way I'm hoping it works. So I hope that's been useful. I'll put up a photograph before I finish, just showing all of this stuff packed away into the pot here. And again, hopefully it'll leave me a bit of space so that I can actually put other items in the pot as well.